Today I'm going to run you through my 3 go-to hip mobility exercises. Whenever I'm feeling tight in my hips or my lower back, these are my go-to bang for buck exercises to loosen up those areas, potentially after a big day on the dirt bike, maybe a long trip in the van traveling. If I'm feeling a little bit tight, these are my go-to exercises. The key component to understand here, and just to frame this up a little bit, this is going to be part 1 of a 2-part series. So if we're talking about improving hip mobility, most people are going to be limited in one of 2 or both, most commonly both ways. One being just simply a straight up structural limitation where the tissue is just not long enough to move into the end range of motion. And 2 is motor control. So once we've gained some mobility or lengthened a position, say with something like a passive stretch. A passive stretch is just, which we're going to run through today, is more of the passive sort of stretching mobility work. It's just holding an end range position. That doesn't really change much unless our brain, our nervous system can control movement into and out of that position under load, or into at least controlling, not necessarily the same position, but controlling that muscle to lengthen in and out of a range of motion, performing an exercise, performing a movement under load, which is our strength training, of course. So that's the other side of this coin. Really important that we're including full range of motion, strength exercises and exercises which challenge us to control a muscle to lengthen in and out of a position. So we're not just going to stretch our way to improve mobility. However, that being said, when we have sort of more of a structural limitation, which is just tightness, whether that be from potentially a past injury or just years on years that's turned into decades, racing dirt bikes, cycling, concept 2 rowing, maybe some running in there, maybe you got a job sitting at a desk, driving a machine, sitting in a van, driving 10, 12, 14 hours more to and from races after racing. All of these things compound over time. We put on top of that most people don't actually train. If you are hopefully doing some strength training, most people sacrifice range of motion for putting more load on the bar. So, or even worse, they just don't load up their strength exercises and also sacrifice range of motion. What that leads to is getting tight. So in those situations, if you are feeling extremely tight, stretching or more of these passive end range holds can make up part of the process to improving our mobility, as long as we layer on the movement as well, which is what I do for all my clients in the race ready programs. And that's the movement side is what we'll touch on in the next episode. Today, it's just more passive stretching. 3 exercises. These are my go-to bang for buck exercises. This first one's going to be just for the glutes, the back side of the hip. It's just a variation of a pigeon stretch. If you're familiar with a 90-90 stretch or any form of pigeon stretch, this is the variation I love to get a good deep stretch. You could use a couch, a coffee table, even your bed, a chair, something, just anything that's elevated. I'm going to throw the front leg up at around about 90 degrees, and then I can just intensify this stretch by letting my hips drop. So if you're extremely tight, your entry point might be up here somewhere. Doesn't really matter where your entry point is. We're just dropping the hips down until we feel a nice deep stretch around the back of the hip and the glute there. And then I'm using my breath. So if you're extremely tight, your nervous system, your brain will probably want to protect that end range. It won't want to lengthen. So it's going to tense up and you might even feel short of breath. So what we want to do is relax the nervous system. Take a deep breath in. And then slowly exhale. And we're just doing that. So almost box breathing on rotation. We're going to hold this position somewhere between 45 to 60 seconds per side. And every time we exhale, we should feel we can soften into that end range just a little bit more. So I won't show you both sides because it's just going to take longer. But we would perform that exercise on both sides of the body, somewhere in that 45 to 60 seconds. You can go longer. Most people are going to be capped out, and that's a 45 to 60 seconds is an effective dosage to actually get a response there. Then we're going to go for the hip flex of the front of the hip. So this is a half kneeling side bend. So just before I get into the rack, the key on this exercise is we're trying to drive the hips forward. So if we just crank into hyperextension and drive our rib cage forward, our hips don't actually move forward as much, and we're not going to get as deep a stretch in the hip flexors. We're trying to stretch this hip flexor region up in sort of the front of the groin, almost there, more so than the quad on this variation. If you don't have a rack, you could just use a doorway, a post on a veranda or something like that. All we need is something to grab hold of. So again, we're starting off the stretch by pushing the hips forward. So pushing the hips forward in space till we feel that stretch in the hip flexor. Then my arm is going to reach over into a side bend. So this top arm is pulling me across, my bottom arm pushing my hips away to the other side. So I've got a deep stretch in my hip flexors, right down, rib cage, lat, shoulder, the whole box and dice. Really, really good stretch. So again, we're finding that stretch, we're holding it. Big breath in. Relaxing in and just getting a little bit deeper into that stretch as we exhale. So again, we would hold that stretch 45, 60 seconds per side. Flip around, hit that other side. This is my other go-to one. This stretch is similar in terms of, I guess, the rib cage and the shoulder in the fact that it's a side bend. However, we're performing it in a standing position. So the side we're stretching in this instance would be my right side. I'm going to stand on my left leg about a foot off here. The back leg is going to go around and touch the edge of the rack or the edge of the doorway, depending on what you're using. And then again, we are using the arm overhead, and that arm that's closest to the rack is pushing me away. So again, nice deep stretch in the shoulder, the lat, the rib cage, but this one targets more the back of the hip and the lower back than the half kneeling side bend. So the half kneeling side bend's more focused around the front of the hip and even the abs, hip flexors, etc. This one, you're going to feel it a lot more through even the glute med, depending on where you're tight. You're going to feel it in the side of the hip, more around the back and into the spinal erectors there, the QL down the side of the spine. So it's really good for opening that up. Again, another area the cops are flogging when we ride, another area that can tighten up when we spend a lot of time sitting or like repeated hip flexion, cycling, rowing, etc. So they're my 3 bang for buck exercises. Again, they're more of those passive. So it's a stretch, more of a passive lengthened position where we're getting into that stretch and holding that end range for the allocated time. So we would perform that in a little circuit. We'd go the pigeon stretch into the half kneeling side bend, into the QL side bend as a circuit, no rest in between. You could go 2 to 3 rounds. 2 rounds is enough for most people to get a result. You could go the 3rd round if you had time. 2 rounds is going to take you like around about 10 minutes to get through that, a little bit over 10 minutes. So it's really good bang for buck, works really well after traveling. The pigeon stretch, if that is too intense, I'll drop a link in the show notes. You could just sub in just a normal 90-90 stretch. We're really just looking for any variation of a pigeon or a 90-90 stretch, which really targets the sort of backside of the hip and the glute there. So, like I said, that's more of the passive sort of mobility work we're talking about, and just, I guess, introducing our body. That's how I sort of look at stretching and these passive sort of holds. We're introducing our body to these end ranges of motion. So it's the safest way for our brain to be introduced to it, to put in a joint in its end range of motion, because it's just a static isometric hold. So once our brain begins to trust that and relax and allow the muscle to lengthen, then we can layer upon movement. Then we can be, okay, can I feel safe now? Can I allow my brain to feel safe to move into this position, allow that muscle to lengthen with a little bit of load in a strength exercise? So we will include a bit of that and some bang for buck exercises that you can work on in the next episode. We'll see you on that one.